The night my mother-in-law introduced me to 200 people as the little nurse who changes bedpans for a living. I was standing 3 feet away from her in a floor-length navy dress, holding a glass of champagne I hadn't touched. She laughed when she said it. A bright, performative laugh, the kind designed to travel across a room. And it did. Heads turned. A few people smiled politely. Someone near the back actually chuckled. I set my glass down on the nearest table, very slowly. And I smiled at her. She had no idea that 6 months earlier, I had been appointed as the regional director of healthcare compliance for the state. She had no idea that her husband's medical group, the one she bragged about at every family dinner, the one she called the most respected private practice in the county, had submitted 4 consecutive years of Medicaid billing irregularities that had landed squarely on my desk. She had no idea that tonight, at her own anniversary gala, I had been invited as an official guest by the hospital board she was desperately trying to impress. She had no idea about any of it. Because she had never once asked me a single question about my work. I want to tell you how I got to that room. Because it didn't happen by accident. My name is Claire. I married my husband Daniel 3 years ago, after 6 years together. Daniel is kind and quiet and nothing like his mother. He grew up watching her perform at dinner parties, at school events, at holiday gatherings, and somewhere along the way, he learned how to disappear inside himself when she started. I learned it too, eventually. But it took me longer. My mother-in-law's name is Margaret. Everyone calls her Maggie, but she introduces herself as Margaret at functions where it matters. She is 61 years old, tall, impeccably dressed, and she has never held a job, outside of managing the social calendar of a man, who built a successful medical practice, from nothing. She is not a bad person in the way that villains are bad. She is bad the way certain weather is bad, not malicious, just indifferent to the damage it causes. From the moment Daniel brought me home, I was measured against a standard I hadn't been given access to. I was 26. I had just finished my master's in public health administration. I was working as a compliance analyst at a mid-size hospital network, a job that required me to understand federal healthcare law, billing codes, audit procedures, and fraud detection at a level most people spend decades reaching. Margaret looked at my job title and heard hospital worker and decided, without further inquiry, that I was a nurse. Not that nursing is anything to be ashamed of, it is one of the hardest and most important jobs in existence. But she said, nurse the way some people say it when they mean less than. Oh, you work at the hospital, she said. The first time we met. That's sweet. Daniel always did like people who take care of others. I explained what I actually did. She nodded with the focused attention of someone waiting for you to finish so they can speak. Over the following years, it continued. At Thanksgiving, she told her sister I did paperwork at a clinic. At Christmas, she introduced me to her friend Patricia as Daniel's wife. She works in healthcare, something administrative. When I was promoted the first time, Daniel told her over the phone, and she said, "Oh, good for her," and changed the subject to a kitchen renovation. I stopped correcting her. Not because I gave up, but because I made a decision. I decided to wait. The thing about being underestimated is that it is, if you are patient enough, one of the greatest strategic advantages a person can have. I had been documenting the billing irregularities in her husband's practice, my father-in-law Gerald's practice, for almost 14 months before the night of the gala. Not because I went looking for them. Because they were submitted to my office as part of a routine regional audit cycle, and my name was on the file before I even opened it and saw the practice name. I disclosed the conflict of interest to my supervisor immediately. I recused myself from the direct investigation. I handed the file to my colleague David and told him to treat it exactly as he would any other case. And he did. But I knew what was in it. And I knew what was coming. Gerald's practice had been billing Medicaid for procedures that did not occur. At a scale that was not accidental. The irregularities went back 4 years. The exposure was significant. My office had already been in quiet contact with the state attorney general's office for 6 weeks by the time Margaret stood at the podium at the Hargrove Hotel ballroom and tapped the microphone twice. The gala was her idea, as most things were. Gerald's practice was being honored by the County Medical Association, a legitimate achievement, the kind that requires years of community service and peer recognition. Margaret had been planning the event for 8 months. She'd hired a florist from Charleston. She'd flown in a catering team. The centerpieces alone reportedly cost $4,000. I had been invited by the hospital board's executive director, a woman named Rosalind whom I'd worked alongside for 2 years. Rosalind was also being honored that evening. She had asked me to attend as part of her table. I had said yes before I knew the full guest list. When Daniel and I arrived and I saw the Hargrove Hotel marquee listing Gerald's practice as a co-honoree, I did not turn around. I found Rosalind. I sat at her table. I ordered water and I waited. Margaret spotted me during the cocktail hour. She crossed the room in a red gown that must have cost more than my first car, and she kissed Daniel on the cheek and looked at me and said, "Claire, I didn't know you were coming. Are you here with the catering team?" I said, "I'm here with Rosalind. I'm at the board table." Something crossed her face. Not quite confusion. More like recalculation. But the cocktail hour was loud, and Gerald was waving her over from across the room. and she moved on without resolving whatever equation she'd started. The program began at 7. Gerald spoke first, gracious, warm, genuinely moved. I will say this for him. Gerald is a better person than the choices he made. I believe that. I think the billing irregularities began as small compromises that calcified over years into something he could no longer see clearly because he'd been inside them too long. That does not make them legal, but it makes them human. Rosalind spoke next. She was brilliant, as always. She talked about the work her team had done on maternal health outcomes in underserved zip codes, and 2 women at the table cried. And I was proud to know her. Then Margaret took the microphone for the tribute portion of the evening, the part she had written herself, had practiced in the mirror, had been waiting months to deliver. She spoke about Gerald's dedication. His sacrifice. His vision. She talked about what it meant to build something lasting, something the community could trust. She talked about legacy. And then, in the way she had always done casually, as a throwaway, as the kind of joke that isn't really a joke, she brought me into it. Of course, not everyone in the family chose the same level of ambition, she said, and there was that laugh again, aimed at the room, and she looked directly at me. Some of us are content to stay small. Gerald's daughter-in-law is here tonight. She works in healthcare too, you know. Mostly paperwork. Very important work, I'm sure. She takes wonderful care of the bedpans. The laugh came from several directions this time. Daniel's hand went rigid on the table next to mine. I put my hand over his. I pressed down gently. I looked at him and I shook my head, once, very slightly. Then I stood up. I had not planned this moment in a cinematic way. I had not rehearsed a speech. But I had known for a long time that a moment like this would come, because moments like this always come, when you spend enough years being invisible to someone who should have seen you, and I had known what I would do when it did. I walked to the edge of the stage. Rosalind's executive assistant, a young man named Theo, was standing near the stairs. He had been at the joint meeting 2 months ago when my office presented the preliminary audit findings to the board. He recognized me. He handed me his floor microphone without being asked. I stepped up. Margaret was still standing at the main podium, champagne glass now in hand, her smile adjusting in real time. I said, "Thank you, Margaret. That was a beautiful tribute. I want to add something, if you don't mind." I turned to the room. 200 people. Board members, physicians, community leaders, local press. Rosalind at the table to my left, perfectly still, watching me with an expression I could not fully read. I said, "My name is Claire. I have been part of this family for 9 years. And in that time, I have been described at events like this one as a nurse, an aide, a paperwork person, a catering employee, and just now someone who manages bedpans." Light laughter. Uncomfortable. I continued. "I am actually the regional director of healthcare compliance for this state. I oversee audit and investigation functions for every Medicaid participating healthcare entity in 4 counties. Including, and I want to be very precise here, the practice being honored tonight." The laughter stopped. "I want to be clear that I am not here in an official capacity this evening. I am here as Rosalind's guest and as Daniel's wife, and I recused myself from the relevant proceedings the moment I identified the conflict of interest. Which is both the legal requirement and the right thing to do." Margaret had not moved. Gerald had gone very still at the head table. "What I can tell you," I said, "is that the work we do in compliance, the paperwork, the audits, the very unglamorous hours of reviewing billing records and cross-referencing procedure codes, that work exists to protect patients. It exists to protect the public funds that pay for their care. And it exists to make sure that the trust this community places in its healthcare providers is not misused." I paused. "I am proud of that work. I have always been proud of it. I'm sorry it took this long to say so out loud." I handed the microphone back to Theo. I walked back to my table. The room was quiet for about 4 full seconds, the kind of quiet that has texture, that you can feel on your skin, and then Rosalind started clapping. Slowly at first. Then others joined. By the time I reached my chair, it was the whole room. Margaret did not clap. Gerald did not clap. I will not tell you it was a perfect moment, because it wasn't, entirely. Daniel held my hand under the table for the rest of the dinner and didn't say much. And I could feel him processing something that would take days to fully surface. There was a version of the evening where I had made things harder for him, and I knew it, and I carried it. What I will tell you is what happened after. Gerald's attorney contacted my office the following Monday to request a meeting about the audit timeline. The investigation had already been underway for 3 months. It did not stop because of the gala, and it did not accelerate. It moved exactly as it should have, which is to say, slowly, carefully, and with full documentation. Gerald ultimately entered into a settlement agreement with the state 6 months later. The terms included repayment of improperly billed funds, a compliance monitoring period, and a financial penalty. His practice continues to operate. He is working with a compliance officer now, someone whose job he once would have described, I imagine, as paperwork. Margaret called Daniel 2 days after the gala. I was in the kitchen when he took the call. I could only hear his side. He said "I know" several times, and then he said, quietly, but clearly, "Mom, she told you what she did for a living. You just didn't listen. She did not call me directly for 11 weeks. When she finally did, it was a Tuesday afternoon. I was at my desk reviewing a flagged billing submission from a pediatric network in the north of the county. My phone buzzed. Her name on the screen. I let it ring twice. Then I answered. She said, "Claire. I wanted to call." I said, "I know." She said, "I don't think I understood what you did." I said, "No. You didn't." A silence. She said, "I'm not sure I understood a lot of things." I didn't fill the silence for her. I let her sit in it, not out of cruelty, but because I think some silences need to be fully inhabited before they mean anything. Eventually, she said, "I'd like to have lunch. If you're willing." I said I'd think about it. I did think about it. For a long time. I talked to Daniel. I talked to my own mother, who has always been the most practical person I know. She said, "You don't have to forgive someone to agree to lunch. Lunch is just lunch. What happens after is up to you." I called Margaret back 3 weeks later. I said yes to lunch. We met at a restaurant. Neither of us had chosen a neutral place, a Tuesday, late enough that the room was quiet. She wore no jewelry except her wedding ring. She ordered soup. She looked, for the first time in 9 years, like someone who had been uncertain about something for a while. She didn't apologize the way people apologize in movies. She didn't have a speech. She said, "I think I've spent a very long time believing that certain kinds of work mattered more than others, and I think that came from somewhere I haven't fully examined, and I think I took it out on you. And I'm sorry for that. It was not everything. But it was real." I could hear the realness of it. I said, "Thank you." And then we ate soup, and talked about Daniel's birthday, and a book she'd been reading, and it was not fixed, and it was not ruined. It was just two people sitting across from each other, starting over from a distance that was still too wide to fully close. But perhaps, slowly, could be walked across. I think about what it cost me to stay quiet for 9 years. I think about the dinners where I smiled at the wrong moment, and the holidays where I absorbed something I should have deflected. I think about how I convinced myself that patience was the same as peace, when really it was just deferred reckoning. But I also think about what I learned by watching. About how power works. About how people reveal themselves when they believe you are no threat to them. About how the most dangerous person in any room is sometimes the one no one is watching. I was never trying to destroy Margaret. I was never trying to take anything from her. I was trying, for a very long time, to be seen, and when it became clear that would not happen on her terms, I chose to be seen on mine. There is a kind of dignity in that. I believe in it still. If you have ever sat at a table where someone looked through you at a holiday, at a work event, at a family dinner, and felt yourself become smaller to accommodate their blindness, I want you to know something. You do not have to choose between patience and power. Sometimes, they are the same thing. Sometimes the most devastating thing you can do is simply become exactly who you already were, and let the room discover it without warning. The night at the Hargrove Hotel, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I didn't say anything that wasn't true. I just stopped letting someone else tell the room who I was. And that, as it turned out, was more than enough.